Hello and welcome to the EDHREC podcast. I'm your host, Joey Schultz, and today we have a very exciting episode for you. EDHREC is changing, and we'd love to tell you how and why. And to help explain all of the cool information about that change today, joining us right now is our resident data scientist. She's got her master's in statistics. She is truly a duchess of data. It's Julia Maddalena. Julia, thank you so much for being on the show with me.
Hi, Joey. Thanks for having me.
It's been so great to see all the work that you were doing for EDHREC to invent some new features and stuff. And I'm really excited to talk about the new feature that EDHREC is going to be implementing today.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Folks may be a little bit familiar with some of your work already. You write the Fire and Ice series on EDHREC.
Yeah, so that actually came out of a request from a user that was curious about whether certain cards were changing in their popularity within a given commander. And so I dug into the data, observed there were some interesting patterns, and then we wanted to particularly highlight, which ones are really growing in the last 6 months, which ones are maybe even falling off in their usage with that commander. Mm-hmm. And we thought it was compelling enough to turn it into an article series. So I've been teaming up with Cooper Gottfried on that. He's been so helpful to provide context and good storytelling around the patterns in that data. And it's been quite fun.
Yeah, it's such a terrific series to see what's trending, which cards are hot or not. And that's actually another thing that you've been involved with on EDHREC. If folks have ever noticed those hot tags that are appearing on cards, those are some of the cards that are trending upwards for those commanders. And that's another thing that you helped implement. So you've been doing a whole bunch of really cool stuff for EDHREC to make it a more accessible and cooler tool to use for everyone to spot the things that might make their commander decks a little bit better. So thank you so much for some of those features. I'm excited to talk about another one that we're implementing with you here today.
Yeah, me too.
This is a feature that actually, when I did my interview with Don on an episode a couple of months ago or so, he teased that there's an upcoming feature called Lift that we're excited to announce to everybody. And it's finally here, really exciting. But to understand what Lift is, we kind of have to start at the beginning. Currently on EDHREC, there's the synergy scores that a lot of people will be familiar with. So let's start there and explain why we are going to be moving from synergy to this other thing called Lift. But let's just get acquainted with the history of this original feature first.
Yeah, so Synergy came out in 2015, so it's been around for 10 years. It's kind of crazy to think about changing it after so long because people have
for real
gotten very used to it. But we've heard from users that Synergy sometimes behaves a bit funny, and I will get into that, the specifics around that. Mm-hmm. But first, do we want to look at how Synergy is calculated and dive in that way?
Yeah, a simple way that I've explained synergy before is that it's kind of a way of measuring a uniqueness of a card within a certain commander's deck, trying to measure how common that card is in that commander's deck compared to other commanders of the same color. But you've got the real math behind it.
Yeah, so as a math person, I wanted to put it in math notation.
Yeah.
So that's what you're seeing here. In simple terms, synergy is the difference between how common a given card is in the context of another card and just how common that card is in general, the usage of that card. But to break it down specifically, this first term is the ratio of the number of decks that contain both cards over the number of decks that contain card A that are in the color universe of both cards. I'll talk about that more later, specifically what that means. The second term is the number of decks that contain card A over the number of decks that could contain card A. So the usage of that card, essentially.
Sort of in layman's terms, it's basically explaining how often that card is played versus other cards within that. I love the term that you're saying, color universe.
Yeah.
For instance, looking just on like Treebeard's page here, I happen to have that one up right now. The card Tireless Provisioner has a high synergy score on that commander's page because it is used in Treebeard decks 61% of the time, but it's used in Selesnya decks generally, which Treebeard happens to be a Selesnya commander, 2% of the time. So it's just that figure minus the other figure, and that's how we get that synergy score. Kind of demonstrating the uniqueness of that card in that deck compared to all Selesnya decks. We've had that feature for a long time because it does show us some cards that are a little bit more unique to that commander than others. But as you said, there are some problems with that.
Yeah, I'll admit I have stared at synergy a lot, and I've never quite liked it. It doesn't feel, while it has had utility and it's been useful to people, I feel that it's not intuitive. It's not an established statistical method. It's just something that Don came up with and worked. Like, he had some test cases that he was like, yeah, this is providing essentially the right data. Yeah, but it's not an established statistical metric. And so after digging in, I found that we could do better.
Right, because this synergy score is kind of useful for a commander page, but it's not as useful on card pages, the stuff that goes into the 99. So that's why we are going to be changing the cards pages to include this lift score instead, because on card pages, the synergy score is just confusing, and it isn't as useful as a metric.
Yes, and so this is one thing that users were regularly writing to us about, that synergy scores, when one of the two cards was ubiquitous, the ubiquitous cards that we consider played at least 50% of the time are Soul Ring, Swords to Plowshares, Arcane Signet, and Command Tower.
Right.
Those always had very funky synergy scores. And I have this histogram here that shows when the main card is ubiquitous, so the card page that you're looking at, the synergy score with any other card was always very low. But the opposite was true. When you were on a card page and you were looking at a ubiquitous card, the synergy with that card was high. That's not expected behavior. I would hope that the synergy score or any good effort to measure synergy with a ubiquitous card would be essentially like they're not synergistic because this card is just always played. There's no...
Right.
It's not particularly played with any given cards more than others.
I guess you would sort of expect it to be sort of a two-way street, and the current calculation is not giving us that two-way street, is it?
Yeah, it is weird, don't you think, Joey, when you look up a card and its synergy score with another card is different than if you go to that other card's page and look at the synergy score with the original. So in this case, it completely flips. It goes from maybe negative 80% synergy to positive 65% synergy. And to me, that's not intuitive. People could make an argument that maybe it should not be symmetric, but I was interested in a metric that would be balanced in that way.
Yeah, so that brings us to this other thing, which we've hinted at before, and which you've been a bit of a mastermind in helping to design, and that is this thing called lift scores, which we're going to be moving towards instead. This is the way that EDHREC is changing. So Julia, what is lift, and why is it better?
Okay, so lift.
You're so excited. I'm really sorry.
All right, so I am excited to introduce lift. It is an established statistical metric. It comes out of the world of association rule mining, which is a machine learning technique for discovering relationships between items in a large data set, which is perfect for this use case of the items being the cards in the large data set, being the deck lists that we have from Moxfield and Architect. So Lift specifically measures the strength of association between items compared to what we would expect if they were independent.
Okay.
That's a mouthful, but hopefully as we go through the math and we look at examples, it will become a little bit more intuitive.
Outside of Magic, how is lift usually applied, like in the real world, I guess you could say? You said this is an established metric. How is this usually used?
It could be like grocery store items, like, how often are peanut butter and jelly bought together?
Gotcha. Perfect. Like as opposed to buying peanut butter and asparagus together.
Yeah.
Less correlation, less association. So now I'm excited to get into some examples of here how that applies to the world of Magic. For instance, a high lift score would be expected between Sanguine Bond and Exquisite Blood, which famously combo together.
Yeah.
You gain life and then the other person loses life and the Exquisite Blood is like, oh, they lost life, I'll gain you that life, and things like that. That's the kind of thing where we would see a high lift score correlated between both of those two cards on each of their individual EDHREC pages.
Yes. Yeah. And thanks for grounding that in the use case.
It's sort of that two-way street thing where it is clearly that these cards' inclusion index have a correlation with each other compared to, just people run Arcane Signet because Arcane Signet is good.
Sure.
And Arcane Signet being in a deck with other cards, that does feel like they're a little bit more independent from each other compared to like, actually these two life gain cards, for instance, have something in common with each other. So having one in the deck means that the other is more likely to be there and vice versa.
Exactly. You've got it, Joey.
To really show off a difference here, like how it's going to manifest on the user's end when they're looking on EDHREC, I pulled up an example of the card Windfall, which is that 3-mana blue sorcery. Everyone discards their hand and then redraws equal to the highest number of cards that were discarded this way. On the original thing, when we were looking at high synergy cards, when you go there, what we were seeing on the page was like Swords to Plowshares, Counterspell, Path to Exile, like a lot of cards that are just ubiquitous, just really famously powerful cards everywhere else. But when we use the lift scores instead, we see cards like Dark Deal, which has a similar effect to Windfall. We see cards like Spiteful Visions and Cataract Parasite, which deal damage to your opponents when they draw extra cards. Jace's Architect, which also has a very similar effect to Windfall. These cards are so much more correlated. It tells me so much more about what this card is used for. And that's, I think, just a great example to show, hey, here's how this is going to be more useful to users. It makes the Windfall card page a really useful thing to look at now to see not just what commanders is this used in, but what other cards get used with it, and not just the super ubiquitous stuff.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that it all makes sense.
and all of that is how it looks on the EDHREC user side of things. Julia, how does it look on like the behind the scenes data side of things?
Yeah, I'll give you a sneak preview for Windfall so we can look at how Synergy and Lift compare for that card. So as we can see, those cards that you mentioned, Dark Deal, Phyrexian Tyranny, Whispering Madness, those are all really high lift. Weirdly, they didn't show up as high synergy before. They had fairly close to 0 synergy scores. So it's good to see those rising to the top. What was showing up as high synergy before is, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Command Tower, Swords to Plowshares. Classic.
The usual, and it's showing us like a good correlation of like, people are playing this index with those other cards, sure, but those are just because they're really famous cards. And that's not actually telling us how these cards interact with each other. It's just telling us that both of the cards are popular.
Exactly. And they have slightly higher than 1 lift scores, but it's a small enough lift score that I sort of see them as more or less independent.
Definitely a smaller lift score than the Dark Deal showing a lift score of like 7.3 and the Spiteful Vision showing a score of 6.8 and stuff like that. Like, it's actually demonstrating, hey, there's a really unique combination of effects that these cards have with each other. So one of them is going to make the other a lot more relevant compared to one of them is popular. And also here are these other popular cards. That wasn't necessarily quite as helpful before.
Exactly. Yes.
That does seem like a much better metric to see that like, these cards are pushing each other up, they're supporting each other, as opposed to just things that are individually good.
So just as it's on the screen, and you're probably curious about this long tail down here of cards played with Windfall that had negative synergy scores, but have very strongly low lift scores. These are all those combinations that we would rarely see. And that's why we see they have very small deck counts. The lowest lift score being with Earthshape and Kyoshi Island Plaza.
Interesting. Some of those are a little bit newer in green and white, and Windfall is most often paired with cards that are in the Grixis color combination. So of course those cards are not going to show up very often with each other. There's no reason for those Selesnya cards to show up in a lot of decks that use Windfall, because Windfall tends to be more centrally located in Grixis type of things, like with Nekosar decks and stuff like that. So that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, so there's no real place on EDHREC for these non-bows, but thought I'd mention them nonetheless.
Yeah, there is actually one more example I'd love to show, and that's going to be on the card Manamorphose. I think this is a really fascinating example. Manamorphose is a 2-mana Gruul spell that gives you 2 mana and draws a card. A very ubiquitous card in like Storm decks that are going to play a whole lot of things all at once and maybe copy a bunch of the spells so you get this effect multiple times over. And what we see, the card that has the greatest lift score with that is actually the card Overmaster, which is a red card that makes sure that your next spell won't be countered that turn. Well, that's going to be really important for a Storm deck. And that's not a thing that we would have ever seen when we were just looking at synergy scores. But it actually has a fantastic combination within decks that care about doing Manamorphose, Stormy type of things. So this is the type of a connection that maybe I wouldn't have been able to make before.
Yeah, and Overmaster lift score of 25.6, pretty close, is Ashling Flame Dancer, Gutshot, Crimson Wisps, Expedite.
Yeah, all cards that get used in those decks that are playing one spell and then chaining it into a whole bunch of other spells and probably copying each of those. They're doing that storm off type of thing. That really tells a story here in a way that the data didn't previously get to tell a story. And that's going to be useful for folks. And it makes the card page from Manamorphose a really interesting space to explore now. Makes each individual cards page a lot more detailed. And I just think that is so useful to folks. So I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, awesome. You got to give the people what they want.
Here's a quick word from our sponsors. This video is sponsored by Commander Rules Deck. Listen, Commander is the greatest game in the world, but it's also complicated. Every playgroup has common questions. The steps of combat, or layers, or how priority works, or what protection means. Rules Deck is a quick reference deck of rules cards that will help you immediately, easily reduce all confusion around weird rules edge cases and avoid any disputes about how things are supposed to work. It's designed like premium TCG cards, portable and intuitive, and they save you a lot of time having to look up forums or Reddit posts or the sheer block of text that is the comprehensive rulebook, or all of those things that can slow down or break up the flow of Commander games so that you can just get right back to the fun. Check them out at the link in the description. Get Rules Deck to upgrade your game night. This show is also sponsored by Dragon Shield, makers of the finest, toughest, best sleeves on the market, and they were so confident in the quality of their sleeves that they sent a sleeved card to space and back. They even have a phenomenal card scanning app that will help you catalog your collection too. It's super fast and super accurate. And you can make custom sleeves with Dragon Shield as well. I recommend checking out our EDHREC sleeves personally. And if you order from Dragon Shield at the link in the description, make sure that you use code EDHREC in all lowercase for a discount, whether you're getting custom sleeves, EDHREC sleeves, or their Fetchland sleeves with officially licensed magic art, or their guild sleeves that are coming up, or dang, there are so many good options. Again, that's Dragon Shield, linked below, code EDHREC, all lowercase, for a discount on your order, and thanks so much to Dragon Shield for sponsoring the show. Those are some direct examples we thought would be helpful for folks, but Julia, would you like to get into the specifics of how all this data gets calculated and properly, fully analyzed?
Yes, of course. I came with the math.
There it is.
All right. So starting simply, just like not speaking about cards specifically, but just the basic definition of lift is it's the probability of any two events co-occurring divided by the product of their individual co-occurrences. So It's worth getting into the subtleties of this. So just to be explicit about what the probability of an event is, it is the number of occurrences of that event divided by the number of potential occurrences of that event. That may sound obvious, but actually that denominator is one of the more complicated parts of determining the lift score, and we'll get into that.
Determining potential. Yeah, that does sound extremely complicated.
For those of you that are familiar with probability theory, if two events are independent, the probability of both those events happening is the product of their individual probabilities. That means that because we're taking the ratio of those two terms, if they are equal, that means the ratio will be 1, and we can conclude that the events A and B are independent. If it's greater than 1, that means they co-occur more often than we would expect if they were completely random or completely independent. And if the lift score is less than 1, then they occur less than randomly. It is a little scary, I'll admit.
It's a lot of numbers on screen right now, not gonna lie.
Yes. If you think this is scary, you should see the SQL code that was required to make the magic happen behind the scenes. But I'll break it down for you. Hopefully it will make a little more sense in a minute. This is the numerator, that's the probability of both events occurring. So in this case, it's the number of decks where we observe both cards A and B, divided by the number of decks that could have contained cards A and B. So the number of decks that are in the color universe of those two cards, divided by the number of decks that could contain card A over the same term, the number of decks that could contain both cards, and then the same term, but for card B.
Terrific. Thank you. This is so detailed. I know the exact math and equations can kind of be a lot, but I also know a lot of folks will really appreciate your transparency here, getting to see how the sausage gets made. So thank you again for that, for spearheading this really cool change. And of course, thank you to our devs for implementing it too. I do want to ask, is there anything that we ought to keep in mind about how to properly interpret lift scores? Like any pitfalls to avoid when we as users are looking at the data as it appears on the site?
So one important distinction I want to make as people transition the way they think about synergy scores to the new lift scores is that they're now on completely different ranges. So synergy score was on the range from negative 100, meaning very anti-synergistic, to 100%, meaning like they always occur together. Lift score is very different because it's a ratio. It behaves logarithmically. So now when you see the number 1, that's basically what synergy score of 0 was.
Okay.
And it can be as low as 0 or as high as infinity, though we don't want to show infinity, or we don't want to show really high numbers. So we actually cut it off around 100. And there's very few lift scores that we observed in the data that were actually greater than 100. So yes, and this is a gross oversimplification. Don't actually line these up and say 50% synergy is equivalent to a 10 lift score, but it's here for demonstrative purposes so you can have an idea of this change.
And thankfully, the way it will present on EDHREC, we'll see some arrows and stuff indicating like, yay, really high score versus, kind of a very normal score, things like that to help people kind of understand it a little bit more fluidly.
Yeah, we want people to know that it's a complete deviation from what they were seeing before and to not compare lift scores to synergy scores in any way.
Now, we've mentioned color universe a couple of times. Does that just mean color identity, like Commander players are already accustomed to when picking what color of cards can go into their Commander deck? Or is there a different meaning for what a color universe is?
Yes. So let's just dig into an example here. So if we had a card that was green-white and another card that was blue, and we're looking at the lift between them, what we consider the potential decks that both of these cards could be in are those that are green, white, blue, or anything beyond that. So green, white, blue, black, green, white, blue, red, green, white, blue, black, red.
Gotcha.
And that would be the color universe of those two cards.
So not quite as constricting as color identity was, where if I'm playing green, white, blue, then I can only play green, white, and blue cards. It would only be measuring from those. We're looking at everything associated from there. Any deck that those cards could go into. Gotcha.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Cool.
Yes. And there's one other little subtlety that I wanted to point out. So when we were talking about what are the potential decks that these two cards could be in, we also have to consider when those cards were spoiled.
Oh, sure.
Yes. As many of you know, we store deck data back 2 years. So if both cards were spoiled before 2 years ago, then we just look back 2 years and all decks are fair game. So if either or both card was spoiled within the last 2 years, we take the later spoiled date of the two cards and we only consider decks after that date. So both of these, the color universe and the spoiled date of both cards, have to be in consideration when we are considering what potential decks these cards could have been in.
Yeah. And folks will be very familiar with this on EDHREC. If you ever see that certain cards have different total numbers of decks that they could go into. For instance, I'm just looking at the Dragons page right here, and we see that the card Scourge of Valkas is showing up in 51% of the 41,000 decks that it's eligible to go in. Whereas the card next to it, Dracogenesis, the denominator there, it's in 52% of 24,000 decks. And it's just like, wait, why are those figures different? It's because Dracogenesis is a newer card. It came out in the Tarkir set, whereas Scourge of Valkas has been around for a long time, and it fits within that 2-year window, whereas Dracogenesis hasn't had as much time to stick around. We want to make sure that we're not counting a brand new card against an entire total of Commander history, because that's not really fair. It hasn't been eligible to show up in that many decks. So we only count the new decks that have been built or updated since those new cards were arriving, and that's obviously also going to be reflected here when we're counting how these cards interact with each other. We don't want to give them an unfair first arrival compared to all the cards that have been around for a lot longer.
Yes, you've got it. And to be fair, this was also factored into synergy scores as well. So it's not new. I just wanted to be very clear that this is how it's being calculated in the background.
Yeah, a very good thing to be aware of. We do get sometimes questions about that, but if folks are ever curious, why are some of the numbers different? That's going to be the reason why, and it's the kind of thing that we want to make sure that we account for any updates that happen to the site.
Yep.
So we noted earlier that one of the frustrations with Synergy is the way that certain ubiquitous cards, they don't have that two-way street, as we were kind of mentioning. How does Lift behave with ubiquitous cards? Do we see an improvement compared to the histogram that we saw earlier?
Yes, so I have those same histograms broken down by whether the main card or the card played with, or both or neither, are ubiquitous. And as we can see here, now, if either or both cards are ubiquitous, they're very likely to have a lift score near 1, which is what we would expect.
Mm-hmm.
And that bottom histogram is useful to sort of see the overall distribution of lift scores when neither card is ubiquitous.
And for folks out there just listening, not seeing the graphs on this, the first one that we looked at was very scattered, not, I guess, all over the place, but certainly farther apart. And here we're seeing stuff more condensed with each other.
Yeah. So I have one last data visualization for you, Joey, to drive home the differences between Synergy and Lift.
Yeah, let's get into it.
I have a scatter plot showing Synergy score on the x-axis and Lift score on the y-axis. It's been transformed logarithmically. And we can see, so if you're in the bottom left quadrant or the top right quadrant of the scatter plot, the two scores are in agreement, at least directionally. So a negative Synergy score and a Lift score below 1.
Right.
Or a positive Synergy score and a Lift score above 1. So this shows that in general, the two scores are in agreement. Mm-hmm. However, they do differ in the magnitude, and especially we can see those the points on the scatter plot on the left-hand side that go very low Synergy scores. Those are almost all ubiquitous cards. And same with that. It's not as obvious, but on the right-hand side, there's a grouping of very high Synergy scores, and all of these now have Lift scores near 1.
Showing that relationship, it's nice to see that, like, it's not that Synergy was ever like completely wrong-footed, but we're seeing a much stronger correlation when we move into the Lift instead, as opposed to just showing individually strong cards. Mm-hmm. So I noticed there are some really low values and some really high values. What does it mean when there are really low Lift scores or really high Lift scores? What does all that mean?
Yeah, I was curious about that too, and I dug into the data, and it looks like when there's a really extreme Lift score in either direction, It's a very rare combination of cards. So when the lift score is really low, the two cards might be commonly played, but together they're almost never seen.
Okay.
And the opposite for very high lift scores, it's still uncommon, but they're almost always seen together. So when one card is played, it's almost always played with the other.
Gotcha.
Sometimes this happens when cards are released in a pre-con.
Yeah.
So that's one thing we've noticed. And so to be aware of that when you see high lift scores.
Yeah. That pre-con effect always coming around to bite us a little bit, but it's the kind of thing that we want to refine as we go, for sure.
So one thing that users will notice is that lift is now live on cards pages. So if you go to any given card, you will no longer see synergy scores. You'll see lift scores with other cards. This has not yet gone live on commanders pages. And it's not because we don't want it. We desperately want it. But there's a couple of reasons that this hasn't happened. The first reason is that synergy scores are not as problematic for commander to card pairs. Unlike with the cards pages where we had the issues with the ubiquitous cards, there's no equivalent of that on the commanders pages. So just to drive that point home, here's that same scatter plot of lift score versus synergy score for commander to card pairs. And as we can see, much more concordance, almost complete agreement between the two scores, at least directionally.
Yeah.
And again, we do see differences in magnitude, but that's one reason why this hasn't been a priority to implement this for commander pages. The other reason is that it's just harder. Like commander pages are significantly more complicated. They have all the filters for brackets, budgets, tags.
Right.
And we have to do some cleanup on the back end to be able to make this possible without dragging down the processing that has to happen in the background. So stay tuned. That will happen.
Yeah.
It's in the works.
Yes. Yeah. But that's a really good thing to point out. When we look on the EDHRECast page, we see that the card Dragon Tempest has a really high synergy score and a really high inclusion rate for the EDHRECast. And knowing that that is more unique to the EDHRECast page in that synergy score calculation way, compared to all of the other 5-color commanders that are out there, that is still a useful metric. Or Crux of Fate. That's also got a high synergy score on the EDHRECast page. Well, yeah, that is going to have a higher synergy, a higher uniqueness to the EDHRECast compared to any other 5-color commander like Go Shintai, which cares about shrines rather than caring about dragons and things like that. So it's still very useful there. But what I love so much about the new lift scores is that now it actually kind of treats those individual card pages as though they are a commander page, where you get to see the other cards that make sense in the decks with them, as opposed to just seeing the cards that were popular in decks with them, which is why we saw the Arcane Signets, the Soul Rings, the Swords of Plowshares, the Counterspells, all the famous cards taking up those spots. Now you'll be able to not just look at the EDHRECast page for interesting dragon synergies that are unique and helpful and correlated, but you can also look at the Dragon Tempest or the Crux of Fate page to also find cards that will work together with those, because those cards are pulling each other up and supporting each other. So it makes those cards useful in a brand new way, which is fantastic to see.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Jill, this has all been really fascinating. I'm excited to get feedback about this new feature as well. Excited to see what happens as players begin to tinker with this.
Yes, I'm excited to see how users feel about it.
What do you think players and deck brewers should keep in mind as they are observing all of this new data?
Joey, I think we can agree the lift scores are an improvement over synergy scores. They're still not perfect, right? They're based on decks that real people have built imperfectly. However, lift scores are a representation of the average trends that we see among these decks. So we do expect, significant lift scores in either direction to be representative of true, strong or negative associations between cards. As with all metrics on EDHREC, they're both based on the decks people build, and they also inform the decks people build. And therefore, we might expect that two cards that have high lift scores will get increasingly high lift scores as people are adding that pair to their decks more frequently. And that will be an interesting pattern to observe over time. And maybe I can do an analysis on that in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I look forward to seeing that in your Fire and Ice series again, to measure those trends and to see how they really do manifest in the data there. But that's a really great thing to keep in mind. EDHREC, I like to say that it's not a prescription, it's a mirror. This is by no means saying, oh, here's what you definitely should play. It's just reflecting what player behavior is. But of course, players will then look in the mirror and potentially make some changes that lean into that or lean away from that. And so there's no way to observe this without it, of course, also continuing to have an effect. And that will also be true of this new feature. But it is exciting to be able to update and advance EDHREC in this way, even though it does mean that we're changing from a thing that was there for 10 or 11 years or whatever. We're moving to this new score, this new way of trying to provide feedback for people. But clearly, based off the examples that we've gone through and how detailed your math is in spearheading this and creating this, it's clear to me that this is going to be a lot more useful to folks. So EDHREC is changing for good. It's doing some really neat stuff that I think players will get a whole lot of use out of and be a lot more informed for and help guide deck building in a really constructive way.
That's the hope.
Well, and thank you so much for finding cool ways to improve the site. This is a site that helps a lot of people, that means a lot to a whole community, and it's a site that can't exist without that community. So it's really nice to get to sit down with one of the masterminds behind how it is that we can improve this tool to help so many people.
Oh, thanks, Joey. Hope to keep doing it.
Thank you once again for sitting down with me and telling all of the folks out there about not just what this feature is and how it can be used, but also all of the detail that went into it. The work really shows. And I really encourage people to check out your Fire and Ice series as well to see the trending cards for commanders. And I hope that people are excited about the features that you're working on, because clearly they're really, really cool and really, really helpful. So thank you again for all that you do for EDHREC and for the community.
Thanks, Joey. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Everyone, we hope you found this entertaining and interesting. And of course, let us know what you think of this new change, of these lift scores, and how they will help out your brewing. But with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. If you'd like to get a hold of us, you can, of course, contact us on all platforms, all socials at EDHRECast, or you can email us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show for even more behind-the-scenes data or some exclusive videos, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And of course, leaving a like, subscribing, leaving us a review of the podcast, supporting the show, and all of those free ways means a whole lot to us too. Thank you so much for joining us on this new journey for EDHREC. We'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck. Bye.
Bye.